My daughter-in-law handed me a stack of papers the same night my grandson blew out the candles on his 18th birthday cake, and she smiled like she'd already won. Perfect timing, she said, sliding them across the table. She thought I was just a tired old man with a fading mind, too weak to fight back. But at the hearing 3 weeks later, it wasn't my lawyer who brought her plan crashing down. It was my grandson. He stood up in that courtroom, looked his mother dead in the eye, and pressed play on a small black recorder he'd been hiding for 2 years. She went white as a sheet and bolted for the door, but the bailiff caught her before she made it 3 steps. What happened after that was exactly what she deserved. My name is Walter Coben. I'm 68 years old, and I live outside Charleston, South Carolina, in a house I built with money I earned the honest way. 41 years running a marine parts supply company out of a rented warehouse by the docks. I didn't inherit a dime. Every contract, every client, every dollar came from my own 2 hands and more sleepless nights than I can count. My son, Gregory, took over the business 12 years ago when my knees finally gave out and my doctor told me to slow down. I stepped back into the role of chairman, keeping half an eye on things, trusting my boy to run what I'd built. Gregory married a woman named Diane about 15 years ago. She was sharp, polished, always said the right thing at the right dinner party. I liked her well enough at first. They had one son, Caleb, my only grandson, a quiet kid who spent more time behind a computer screen than in front of people. Gregory used to joke that the boy would rather debug code than eat dinner with the family. I always figured that was just how some kids were built. I never once imagined that boy was quietly watching everything, remembering everything, waiting. If you're just joining me, and you've got a parent or a grandparent who taught you what real family loyalty looks like, do me a favor and hit that like button. It means more to an old man than you'd think, knowing somebody out there is listening. Drop a comment and tell me what state you're watching from tonight. Now let me tell you what happened in my own family, because I still can't quite believe I lived through it. It started on a Friday evening in late spring, Caleb's 18th birthday. Gregory had asked me to come over for the family dinner, and I'd driven the 20 minutes from my place with a card and a check tucked in my jacket pocket, the kind of gift an old man gives when he doesn't know what a computer kid actually wants. I walked into Gregory's house expecting balloons, expecting the smell of a grill going in the backyard. Instead, the house was dead quiet. No music, no smell of food. The dining room table had exactly one thing on it, a thick manila envelope, sitting square in the middle like a landmine. Diane was sitting at the head of the table in a black dress, a glass of wine already half gone in her hand. Gregory was nowhere in sight. Caleb sat across from her, spine straight, staring at an empty plate like it owed him money. I asked where everybody was, where the cake was, why it felt like a funeral in that house instead of a birthday party. Diane looked up at me slowly, and I will never forget the smile she gave me. It wasn't warm. It wasn't even cruel exactly. It was satisfied, like a woman who'd just closed a business deal. Caleb's 18 now, she said. Legally an adult. That means Gregory and I don't have any reason to keep pretending anymore. She slid the envelope toward me. Go on, Walter. Open it. You're part of this family. You should see it too. My hands felt strange, heavy, as I pulled the papers out. Divorce filing. But it wasn't a simple divorce. She was asking for full ownership of the house, a lump settlement of $2 million. And this is the part that made my stomach drop: a 20% equity stake in Coben Marine Supply, the company I had spent 4 decades building from nothing. I looked at her and asked how in the world she thought she was entitled to a piece of my company. She'd never worked a single day there. She laughed, short and sharp, the kind of laugh that echoes wrong in a quiet room. Because your son can't run that place without me managing his calendar, his moods, and lately, apparently, his memory, she said. Gregory's been slipping for the last 2 years, Walter. Forgetting meetings, losing track of shipments, getting confused in front of clients. I've been covering for him, propping him up, doing damage control so the board doesn't notice how bad it's gotten. I've earned that stake. I turned and looked at my son for the first time since I'd walked in, and that's when the floor of my whole world tilted. Gregory was sitting in the doorway to the kitchen, and he looked wrong, pale, sweating slightly, his eyes glassy in a way I hadn't noticed before because I hadn't been looking. He mumbled something about needing to lie down and shuffled off toward the bedroom without even glancing at the papers that were about to gut his marriage and his inheritance in the same stroke. I looked at Caleb next, expecting to see a boy devastated, maybe crying, maybe screaming at his mother. Instead, his knuckles were white where his hands gripped the edge of the table, and his face was a mask of something far colder than grief. He wasn't looking at me for comfort. He was staring straight at his mother. "You really think this is going to work?" Caleb said quietly. His voice didn't shake at all, which somehow scared me more than if it had. Diane rolled her eyes at him the way you'd wave off a child asking for candy before dinner. "You'll understand when you're older, sweetheart," she said, and turned back to me, her voice going flat and hard. "Walter, I want to be very clear. If you or Gregory try to fight this, I have 2 years of documentation, missed medication, confused phone calls, a doctor who's willing to testify that Gregory is in the early stages of some kind of cognitive decline. I will use every bit of it to make sure the court sees exactly how unstable this family really is. Don't test me." I stood there holding those papers, and God help me, part of what she said rang true. Gregory had been different the last 2 years, distracted at board meetings, forgetting things he never used to forget. I had chalked it up to stress, to the pressure of running the company, to getting older like all of us do. But standing in that cold dining room, looking at my grandson's face and my daughter-in-law's calculating eyes, a sick feeling started crawling up the back of my neck. This hadn't been an accident. This had been built, brick by brick, over 2 solid years. I pushed my chair back, picked up the envelope, and told her I needed time to think. I did not raise my voice. I walked out to my truck in the warm evening air and sat behind the wheel for a long time before I could make myself turn the key. 2 nights later, there was a knock on my door well past 11. I opened it to find Caleb standing on my porch, soaked from a sudden rain shower, his backpack slung over one shoulder like he'd walked the whole way instead of driving. He didn't say hello. He just held out his hand. In his palm was a small orange prescription bottle. I stared at it, not understanding. He walked past me into my living room, sat down on the edge of my couch, and finally looked up at me with eyes that had clearly not slept properly in longer than a few nights. "Grandpa," he said, "for the last 2 years I've been swapping out Dad's blood pressure pills." The words didn't make sense at first. I asked him what on earth he was talking about. Gregory took a small daily pill for his blood pressure. Had for years, prescribed by his regular doctor. Caleb shook his head slowly. "That's not what's actually in the bottle, Grandpa. Not anymore." He told me that 18 months ago, he'd noticed his mother handling his father's medication personally every single night, measuring out pills from a separate container she kept locked in her nightstand, not the pharmacy bottle at all. Curious, suspicious of nothing in particular at first, he'd waited for a night she was out and picked the lock. Inside, he found a stash of unmarked white tablets that didn't match anything his father was supposed to be taking. He was 17 and terrified, but he was also, as it turns out, remarkably good with a computer and remarkably patient. He photographed the pills, researched pharmaceutical databases, cross-referenced markings, and eventually identified them as a strong prescription sedative, the kind given to elderly dementia patients to keep them calm. Definitely not something a 50-year-old man managing a marine supply company should be swallowing every single night with his coffee. "She's been drugging him, Grandpa," Caleb said, slowly. "Just enough every day to make him foggy, forgetful, slow. Not enough to put him in a hospital. Just enough that everyone at the company, everyone at the country club, everyone in this whole town starts to believe he's losing his mind." I sat down hard in my armchair. I asked him why. God help me. Why would a mother do that to her own husband? "Because it's not just about the divorce," Caleb said. "It's never just been about the divorce." He opened his laptop and showed me what he'd found over 18 months of quietly, carefully investigating his own mother. It started with a phone notification he'd seen by accident, a text from a man named Curtis Halloway, the company's operations director, a man Diane had personally recommended Gregory hire 3 years back. The text wasn't professional. Caleb didn't need to explain what it meant. Instead of confronting anyone, instead of running to his father in tears, that 17-year-old boy made a decision that still gives me chills to think about. He built a secure server in his bedroom closet. He cloned his mother's cloud backups. He tracked emails, financial transfers, calendar entries, and when digital evidence wasn't enough, when he realized paper trails could be argued away in court, he ordered small audio recorders online with his saved allowance money and planted them in the house, the kitchen, the study, even inside a decorative clock in the living room. I needed to hear it in her own voice, he told me. Not screenshots, not deleted messages a lawyer could say were fake. Her actual voice. He pulled up a folder of audio files and warned me before he pressed play. What came out of his laptop speakers was Diane's voice. Relaxed, almost bored, talking to Curtis Halloway about how easy it had been to keep Gregory sedated enough that he'd sign off on shipment records without reading them, how the neurologist she'd been paying under the table was ready to testify to early cognitive decline whenever she needed him to, how once the divorce went through and she had her equity stake locked in, the two of them could slowly bleed the company's freight contracts into a shell logistics operation Curtis had quietly registered in Delaware 2 years earlier. I sat in my own living room at midnight listening to a woman calmly plan the financial destruction of my son, and I felt something in my chest go cold and still in a way I hadn't felt since I buried my own father. I wanted to drive straight to that house and drag Diane out onto the front lawn myself. Caleb grabbed my arm before I could stand up all the way. "Not yet, Grandpa," he said. "If we go in loud right now, with no pills in hand and no paper trail, she'll say I'm a troubled kid making things up to protect Dad in a custody fight. She'll say it's proof he's paranoid, that his mind really is going, that I've been coached. That's exactly the story she wants a judge to hear." He was right, and it terrified me how right a boy that age could be about something that dark. I asked him what he thought we should actually do. "We need real financial proof," he said, "something a lawyer can't argue away. And we need Dad off those pills long enough to think clearly, without Mom realizing we know anything." The next morning, I called Marion Ashcroft, my attorney for the better part of 3 decades, a woman who had negotiated shipping disputes with people meaner than any divorce lawyer in this state. I sat in her office and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment, tapping her pen against a legal pad, and then she said the same thing Caleb had already told me the night before, just with more legal vocabulary attached. "Walter, if she's going after equity in the company and not just cash, that tells me she's not trying to walk away. She's trying to plant a flag inside it. People who want out of a marriage take the money and go. People who want control take shares." Marion filed for an independent forensic audit of the company's books that same week, quietly, routed through a private accounting firm out of Atlanta so word wouldn't travel back through the office grapevine to Curtis Halloway. Caleb, meanwhile, went back to playing exactly the role his mother expected, a withdrawn, sullen teenager glued to his bedroom, invisible, harmless. Every single night for the next several weeks, he continued swapping his father's sedative capsules for plain vitamin tablets of the same size and color, buying Gregory back a little of his own mind, one dose at a time, all while never once letting Diane suspect a thing had changed. It took 3 weeks for the auditors to build a complete picture, and when they finally called me into a conference room to lay it out, I understood the full, ugly scope of what had been happening under my own roof for 2 years. Curtis Halloway had been rerouting a portion of every major freight contract through a company called Palmetto Logistics Solutions, registered in Delaware, owned on paper by an associate of his, but funded and controlled, according to the wire transfer trail, jointly by Curtis and Diane. Nearly $3 million had quietly bled out of Coben Marine Supply over 18 months, dressed up as consulting fees, equipment leasing charges, and vague logistics optimization services that never actually existed, and buried in an encrypted folder the auditors managed to crack was something even worse. A full business plan for a rival freight brokerage, built using our exact client list, our pricing structures, our proprietary routing software that Gregory had spent years developing. They weren't just skimming money. They were building their own competitor company on the bones of mine, waiting for the divorce to hand Diane enough equity and enough boardroom leverage to force a sale or a liquidation, at which point she and Curtis would simply walk across the street with our clients in tow. I sat in that conference room feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a rage so cold and precise it didn't even feel like anger anymore. It felt like clarity. 2 days later, Marion called me with news that made my blood run cold in a different way. Diane had filed an emergency petition asking the court to grant her temporary guardianship over Gregory's financial and medical decisions, citing sworn statements from a private neurologist claiming Gregory showed clear signs of early-onset dementia, unable to reliably manage his own affairs. If a judge signed off before the divorce trial even started, she wouldn't need to wait for equity through a settlement. She'd simply control everything Gregory owned, immediately, by court order. Marion's plan required something almost unbearably difficult of me and of Gregory both. though Gregory still didn't know the full truth yet. We had to let the hearing happen exactly as Diane expected, keep our evidence sealed, and let Gregory undergo an independent medical evaluation by state-certified doctors who had no connection to Diane's paid neurologist. Until those results came back, Gregory had to keep behaving, in front of Diane, exactly like a man in decline. He didn't need to fake it, honestly, because he was still foggy from years of accumulated sedative in his system, not knowing yet that his own son had been quietly working to clear it out. I sat Gregory down myself 2 nights before the hearing and told him everything. I watched my grown son's face crumble and then harden as the truth landed on him in pieces. His wife, his best friend from the office, 2 years of being slowly poisoned into looking incompetent, his own teenage son secretly fighting a war to protect him that he never even knew was happening. He put his head in his hands at the kitchen table and didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clear in a way I hadn't seen in longer than I'd realized. "He did all that for me," Gregory said quietly, meaning Caleb, "every single night." The morning of Gregory's independent evaluation, 3 state-certified physicians ran him through hours of cognitive testing, memory assessment, and neurological screening. With the sedative finally out of his system for good, thanks to months of Caleb's quiet substitution, Gregory answered every question with total clarity, recalled financial figures from memory, walked the doctors through complex freight routing logistics without hesitation. The lead physician told Marion afterward, plainly, that there was no trace of cognitive impairment whatsoever, and that whatever the private neurologist had documented previously bore no resemblance to what they were seeing. Marion moved immediately to have the results sealed pending the hearing, so Diane would have no idea her entire medical case had just been demolished. The hearing arrived on a bright Tuesday morning, humid the way Charleston gets in early summer. Diane walked into that courtroom in a modest navy dress, dabbing gently at her eyes with a tissue, playing the exhausted, devoted wife for the small gallery of court staff and passers-by in the hallway. Curtis Halloway sat near the back in an expensive suit, looking entirely too relaxed for a man whose business fraud was sitting in a sealed folder 2 tables away from him. Diane took the stand first and gave what I can only describe as a performance. She spoke in a trembling voice about years of quietly caring for a husband whose mind was slipping away, about sleepless nights, about her fear of what would happen to the company if Gregory continued making erratic decisions. She said she wasn't asking for equity out of greed but out of necessity, to protect the family's future from Gregory's own decline. Her paid neurologist took the stand next and testified with total confidence that Gregory showed clear signs of early dementia and required immediate intervention. Marion did not cross-examine him. She simply said she had no questions and sat back down. I watched Diane's face flicker with confusion at that, just for a second, before settling back into satisfaction. She thought we'd given up. Then Marion stood, walked to the center of the courtroom, and said we rejected the entire petition outright and that our first witness would be Caleb Coben. A quiet murmur ran through the small gallery. Diane's attorney shot to his feet, objecting that a minor had no place testifying in a financial guardianship matter. The judge overruled him flatly, noting Caleb had turned 18 only weeks earlier and was fully entitled to testify if the court found it relevant. Before Caleb even took the oath, Marion handed the judge a sealed envelope containing the independent medical evaluation. The judge read it in silence, and I watched the sympathy that had been building on her face for Diane's performance evaporate into something much harder, much colder. Then she looked toward the paid neurologist and asked him to explain how his diagnosis squared with a clean bill of cognitive health from 3 independent state physicians conducted just days earlier. The man's composure fell apart in real time. He stammered something about differing testing methodologies and all but fled the courtroom the moment he was excused. Caleb took the stand next, steady, calm, 18 years old and somehow carrying himself like a man twice his age. He described picking the lock on his mother's nightstand at 16, finding the pills, researching them, discovering what they actually were. He explained, in plain and devastating detail, that he had spent nearly 2 years swapping his father's medication for vitamins every single night, quietly protecting his father's mind while the rest of the family had no idea a war was even being fought inside their own house. Diane came apart at that point exactly like the reports I'd read from that other family's story online had described happening in courtrooms before, some kind of pattern to how people break when the mask finally comes off. She stood up screaming that Caleb was lying, that I had poisoned the boy's mind against her, demanding the judge strike the testimony. Caleb didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small black recorder. "I knew you'd say that," he said, and asked the judge for permission to submit the audio. Diane's attorney objected furiously, but the judge, already furious herself over the fraudulent medical testimony she'd just witnessed, overruled him and had the bailiff connect the recorder to the courtroom system. The first recording that played was Diane's own voice, cold and businesslike, telling Curtis that Gregory was compliant enough now, and that once the guardianship was granted, she'd have full authority to approve the sale of 2 major shipping contracts straight to Palmetto Logistics before anyone at the company noticed the client list had walked out the condo door. The second recording was Curtis, laughing, confirming that nearly $3 million had already been rerouted, and that once Diane had her guardianship locked in, they'd force liquidation of enough company assets to fund their new operation outright. The courtroom went dead silent, except for the low hum of the recording finishing. Diane's face had gone the color of ash. Curtis, in the back row, rose halfway out of his seat like he meant to simply walk out the door, and that's when 2 men in dark suits, who had been sitting quietly near the exit for the entire hearing, stood up and moved toward him. Marion had contacted federal investigators weeks earlier, once the shell company wire transfers crossed state lines into clear fraud territory, and they had been waiting for this exact moment. Curtis didn't resist. He put his hands behind his back without a word, the picture of a man who suddenly understood the size of the hole he'd dug for himself. Diane, meanwhile, made a break for the exit, exactly the way I'd told you at the start of this story. She didn't get far. The bailiff caught her by the arm halfway down the center aisle, and she screamed, thrashed, accused everyone in that room of conspiring against her, swore the recordings were illegal, swore her own son had betrayed her out of some manipulation I'd supposedly fed him. The judge held her in contempt on the spot and had her escorted out in handcuffs, her guardianship petition and her divorce settlement, demands both effectively dead in the water behind her. That evening, back at Gregory's house, the 3 of us sat in the kitchen in a silence that felt, for the first time in 2 years, actually peaceful instead of heavy. Gregory reached across the table and put his hand on his son's shoulder, and I watched a grown man struggle to find words big enough for what his boy had done for him. "You carried all of that alone," Gregory said, "for 2 years." Caleb just nodded, exhausted in the particular way that comes from finally being allowed to put something down after carrying it for far too long. In the months that followed, the case against Curtis Halloway expanded into full federal wire fraud charges once investigators traced the Delaware Shell Company's full history, and he eventually accepted a plea deal that kept him out of prison but stripped him of every asset tied to the fraud and barred him from any executive role in logistics for a decade. Diane's criminal exposure turned out to be narrower, since the poisoning charges were harder to prove without a direct medical link to lasting harm. But the civil judgment Marion secured against her wiped out any claim to Gregory's company or assets entirely, and she left the state within the year with nothing but what she'd walked in with 15 years earlier. The company itself came back stronger than I ever expected. With Curtis gone, an internal audit revealed how much healthier the books actually were without his siphoning, and Gregory, finally clear-headed for the first time in 2 years, restructured the executive team from the ground up, bringing in an outside operations director with a background clean enough that Marion herself ran 3 separate checks on him before Gregory would even offer an interview. As for Caleb, I did something I probably should have done regardless of anything Diane ever did, something I'd been quietly saving up for since the day he was born. I paid his full tuition to Georgia Tech, where he's now studying computer engineering. The same skills that had quietly protected his father for 2 years now aimed toward building something instead of just uncovering something. I told him plainly that his job now was simply to be 18, to go to parties, to make mistakes that didn't matter, to stop carrying the weight of grown men's problems on shoulders that young. A few weekends after everything settled, Gregory and I took Caleb out on my old fishing boat, out past the marsh grass where the water goes flat and quiet in the early morning. Nobody said much of anything for a long while. We just sat there with our lines in the water, listening to the birds working the shallows, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence between the 3 of us didn't feel like something anyone was hiding inside of. It just felt like peace. I looked over at my grandson that morning, 18 years old, still carrying the tired eyes of someone who'd grown up faster than any kid should have to, and I told him the truth as plain as I could say it. I told him I was prouder of him than I had ever been proud of anything I'd built in 41 years of running that company. Because a company is just wood and steel and contracts, but what he'd done was save his father's mind and his father's life, quietly, alone, for 2 straight years, without ever once asking for anything in return. People look at a man my age and think the years have made me soft, made me slow, made me someone easy to push around in a courtroom or a boardroom. Diane made that exact mistake, and it cost her everything she thought she'd already won. What she never understood is that quiet doesn't mean weak, not in an old man, and not in a teenage boy either. Sometimes the person watching silently from the corner of the room is the one keeping the whole family standing upright, and you don't find out how strong they really are until the day they finally decide to speak. Trust the people who show up quietly, year after year, without asking for credit. Watch closely for the ones who only show kindness when someone else is in the room to see it. And never, ever underestimate what a person you love is willing to carry for you in silence, long before you ever find out the truth. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that like button and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and who in your own life has quietly had your back without you ever realizing it. Take care of each other out there. I'll see you in the next one.